Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, we return to the quiet countryside where Diep and James are building not just a fruit business, but a family. Just when things begin to bloom, an old conflict resurfaces. James's father, still rooted in traditional pride and expectations, can't accept that his son has chosen a divorced woman with a child. His words cut deep, forcing James to choose between the life his father built for him and the love he's built on his own. What follows is a story about courage, family, and the cost of standing by what truly matters. Stay until the end, because this isn't just about business or bloodlines. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us. Evening settled over the pomelo orchard, where golden light fell through the dense leaves like tiny coins. Diep led James along the narrow dirt path between the trees, her boots brushing against wild grass, her voice calm, yet filled with quiet pride. "These honey pineapples ripen between August and September," she said, bending to touch the thornless leaves that fanned wide like open hands. "We have to care for them starting March, especially when the soil starts to dry out." James followed closely behind, his long steps careful on the uneven ground. He pointed to the far end of the grove, where a small ditch separated their land from another plot. "Up to here. It's ours, right?" Diep nodded, her face glowing under the last of the sunlight. "Yes, and that's why I was thinking," she said thoughtfully, glancing toward the stream. "We can raise ducks under the pomelo trees. They'll eat pests, keep the ground cool, and won't hurt the roots." James laughed softly, picturing it. Dozens of white ducks waddling along the shallow water, their quacks mixing with the rustle of leaves and hum of crickets. "You always find a way to make things work, Diep." She smiled, but didn't answer. In her mind, she wasn't just tending to fruits or ducks. She was nurturing the fragile hope of a better life. The pineapples weren't sweet yet, but Diep saw potential in every row. "Last year, this grove earned nearly 20 million, she said quietly, her fingers tracing the rough stem of a plant. "If we care for it better, I believe we'll do even more." The afternoon sun slid lower, stretching their shadows long across the red earth. Sweat clung to Diep's forehead, but she felt something more than exhaustion, a strange mix of responsibility and pride. The land wasn't just soil and trees anymore. It was their future. Near the small wooden shack, Nee sat waiting, swinging her legs and watching ants carry rice grains in neat lines. Diep knelt beside her, brushing dust off the child's hair. "Stay inside, okay? Auntie's going to the market for dinner." Nye nodded, her small face glowing with the kind of curiosity that only new beginnings bring. When Diep disappeared down the road, James returned, shirt damp from rain. "The contract's signed," he said with relief, tossing a set of papers onto the table. "We can open the fruit shop tomorrow." Diep's heart fluttered with excitement. But before she could speak, James's phone rang. The voice on the other end was firm, older, layered with expectation. "James," his father began, tone brisk. "You're still in Vietnam? Work there's going fine?" James leaned against the bamboo chair, watching the rain trickle down the window. "It's fine, Dad. Just tiring." The silence that followed was sharp enough to slice through the distance. His father's voice softened, but the weight remained. I heard about that woman, Diep, and the child. You're serious about them? James's jaw tightened. Yes, Dad, I am. She's divorced, isn't she? And that girl, someone else's daughter. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, echoing his father's disapproval. You've always made decisions from your heart, the older man continued. But this isn't just emotion. Think of your career, your reputation. The company still bears our family name. James closed his eyes, every word pressing heavier on his chest. I'm not abandoning the company, Dad. But Diep and Nye are my family too. Family. The voice crackled through static. You barely know her. You can't just take responsibility for another man's child. I can, James said, voice low but steady. Because I love her, and I love Nye. For a moment, only the sound of rain filled the air. Then came the sentence that sliced through everything. Choose, James. Diep or the company. His breath caught. The paper in his hand crumpled. You can't ask me that. I'm not asking. His father replied coldly. If you go through with this adoption, you'll lose more than my support. James gripped the phone tighter. You once accepted Diep when you thought we were just dating. What changed? What changed, his father snapped, is you trying to raise someone else's child. Do you think I built this empire for you to throw it away on some broken family? Something in James snapped. I'm an adult, Dad. I know right from wrong. If you can't be at my wedding, I'll still go on without your blessing. Silence. Then came a deep sigh. You sound just like Hung, his father muttered bitterly. Always stubborn, never thinking of the family. At that name, James's chest tightened. Hung, his older brother, had been missing for 3 days somewhere in Cambodia, working on an export deal. His father's voice softened, heavy with fatigue. He hasn't answered calls, but he's probably fine. Don't worry. But James did worry. The rain, the silence, the memories, they tangled in his head until he could barely breathe. He imagined Hung, lost somewhere deep in a forest, his phone out of range, danger lurking. Keep me updated, James said quietly before hanging up. The shack fell into silence. Rain drummed the tin roof, relentless. James sat motionless for a long time, torn between two impossible loyalties. The family that raised him and the one he was building. That night, Diep fanned glowing coals in the small kitchen. The smoke stung her eyes, but she didn't complain. Nye ran around the tiny space, her laughter cutting through the gloom. Auntie's grilling meat, Diep said softly, turning skewers over the fire. When you finish your drawing, show me, okay? Nee nodded, tongue peeking out as she sketched with fierce concentration. Outside, rain still whispered on the roof. Diep smiled faintly, imagining James walking in, shaking off the storm. He must be hungry, she murmured, laying out bowls of rice. A moment later, the door creaked open. Not James, but Mrs. Huyen, carrying a plastic bag filled with herbs. I bought coriander and mint, she said, setting them down. For grilled pork, it smells better. Diep's heart lifted. Thank you, Mom. Mrs. Huyen's voice softened. So, you're opening the fruit shop tomorrow? Diep nodded. Yes, Near the main intersection. We'll buy directly from farmers. It's close enough for deliveries. Her mother frowned slightly. And capital. Do you have enough? Not really, Diep admitted. But I'll figure it out. I don't want to burden James. Huyen sighed, but her eyes glimmered with pride. You've worked hard, Diep. Just promise me you'll ask for help when you need it. Diep smiled. The kind of smile that hides exhaustion but radiates strength. Then the phone buzzed again. James's number. Diep answered quickly, but the connection was rough. Hung's still missing. His voice came through faintly. Dad's upset. Diep's smile faded. He'll come back soon, she said, trying to sound certain. Mrs. Huyen, overhearing, looked worried but forced a gentle tone. The forest's dense there. Maybe he lost signal. Dinner preparations continued under the dim oil lamp. The smell of grilled meat filled the air, mixing with unspoken worries. Diep arranged everything neatly on the mat. Bowls, chopsticks, a pot of soup, trying to keep her hands busy. Nee brought a small cup of water. For you, Auntie, she said sweetly. Diep knelt to take it, her heart swelling. In that quiet little shack, under the flicker of the lamp, their small family glowed with a fragile warmth. A moment of peace before the storm she didn't yet know was coming. The following morning broke cold and gray. The storm had passed, but puddles still mirrored the bruised clouds overhead. Diep woke early, the smell of wet earth clinging to the air. She wrapped her scarf tightly and began arranging crates of fruit under the small bamboo shelter that would serve as their new shop. Nye followed, sleepy-eyed but eager. Auntie, can I help? Of course. Diep smiled, handing her a rag. Wipe the pomelos so they shine. Customers love clean fruit. Then through the crowd, she saw James. He looked exhausted, his shirt still damp from travel, but his smile was there, the kind that always reached his eyes. The shop looks amazing, he said, brushing his hair back. Diep exhaled in relief. You came back fast. I couldn't miss your first day, he said, handing her a small plastic bag. Inside were warm, sticky rice cakes wrapped in banana leaves. Breakfast for my hard-working boss. She laughed softly. Boss? More like tired vendor. They ate together on the edge of the shop, watching people bustle past. For a moment, it almost felt like life had found its rhythm again. But then James's phone buzzed. He stared at the screen, the color draining from his face. It's Dad, he murmured. Diep's hand paused midair. Answer it, she urged quietly. He hesitated, then swiped to accept. Dad? The voice on the other end was clipped, authoritative. James, I've spoken with the board. If you insist on staying in Vietnam with that woman, we're removing your name from the next company investment. James blinked, stunned. You're cutting me out of my own project? You made your choice, his father replied coldly. We'll handle the company without distractions. I can't risk reputation for your personal affairs. Reputation? James repeated bitterly. You mean pride. You care more about how people see you than about your own son. Watch your tone, came the warning. Diep stood silently beside him, her hands clenched at her sides. She could hear every word, the judgment, the rejection. But she stayed still, not wanting to make things worse. James drew a long breath. "Then fine," he said finally, voice shaking. "If that's what it takes, I'll build something new, without your help. Don't make me regret raising you." His father's voice hissed before the line went dead. The silence afterward was deafening. Diep stepped closer, laying a gentle hand on his arm. "James, you didn't have to." "I did," he interrupted softly. "Because you and you're my family now. Dad can't see that yet, but someday, maybe he will." She wanted to believe him, but deep down, she knew love alone wouldn't stop the coming storm. That night, while Nye slept curled up under a mosquito net, Diep found James sitting outside, staring at the orchard. The moonlight washed over his face, revealing the tired lines around his eyes. "Thinking about your father?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "I just never thought he'd hate me for choosing differently." Diep sat beside him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes parents don't understand right away. Maybe they see love as weakness, when it's really the strongest thing." James turned to her, searching her face. "And if he never accepts it?" She smiled faintly. "Then we'll build something so good he'll have no choice but to notice." Her words hung in the cool air, soft yet fierce. He reached for her hand, fingers intertwining, the promise unspoken but certain. Days passed. News about Hung finally arrived. He'd been found in a remote village after losing communication for days. Relief spread across the family. But when James called to ask, his father didn't sound grateful. Instead, he said coldly, "At least one of my sons still knows his responsibilities." James froze. "You mean Hung?" "Yes," his father replied. "He's coming home to help with the company. You should take notes." The insult stung, but James stayed calm. "I'm glad he's safe," he said simply. After the call, Diep noticed the tension in his shoulders. "He still blames you?" James nodded. "But it's okay. I can't change him overnight. I'll prove myself with results." And he meant it. Over the following weeks, James poured himself into work. He helped Diep expand the fruit business, negotiating better prices, connecting with wholesalers, even designing new packaging. Their little shack turned into a small store, its signboard hand-painted but proud. Diep and James Fruits. Customers began to recognize them. Some called Diep the pineapple lady. Others joked about James being the foreign boss with muddy shoes. They laughed together, hearts lighter with each passing day. But happiness, as always, came with new trials. One afternoon, a sleek black car pulled up outside the store. James's heart sank when he saw who stepped out. His father. Dressed impeccably, his sharp eyes took in the surroundings with silent disapproval. "Dad," James breathed, standing straighter. "You came." The older man didn't reply immediately. He looked around. The crates of fruit, the dirt path, the hand-painted sign. Then his gaze fell on Diep, who wiped her hands nervously and greeted him politely. "So," his father said coolly, "this is the woman who changed my son's life." "Yes, sir," Diep said softly, bowing her head. "I'm sorry if I didn't come for apologies," he interrupted. "I came to see what my son threw everything away for." James's fists tightened. "I didn't throw anything away. I just chose a different life." His father's eyes flicked toward Nye, who stood behind Diep clutching a drawing. "And the child?" he asked bluntly. "She's ours," James said firmly before Diep could speak. The older man frowned deeply. "Yours? She's not your blood, James. Do you even understand what that means in our family?" "Yes," James replied, steady as stone. "It means nothing if we love her." For a long moment, the only sound was the rustle of pomelo leaves outside. The father looked at his son, at the determination in his eyes, and something unreadable flickered in his face. Anger, maybe sorrow, maybe reluctant respect. "You're more stubborn than I thought," he muttered finally. "Maybe," James said, meeting his gaze. "But I learned that from you." The older man turned away, stepping toward the car. "I can't stop you anymore," he said quietly, "but don't expect my blessing." "I don't need it," James said softly. "Just your understanding one day." Without another word, the man got in his car and drove away, leaving a swirl of dust behind. Diep stood beside James, eyes moist but full of pride. "You did the right thing." James exhaled slowly, watching the road fade into distance. "Maybe. But I hope someday he'll see that love doesn't make me weak. It's what made me stronger."